This is the first event that public event that I've done since coming on as editor-at-large of New Labor Forum. And I wasn't even looking for this the other day, but I was going through some old tweets, and I was in 2021, and I found a tweet that said, New Labor Forum is a criminally underrated journal, in my opinion. So I still believe that, although we're working to change that criminally underrated part. It is a great journal, in my opinion, the best scholarly journal about the labor movement in the United States. So I hope you all pick up a copy of our newest issue. We've also got a new issue going to press this week. This is a journal that's published 3 times annually, and it's through SLU. So please pick it up and check it out. Particularly the section in the new issue that, as Sarah mentioned, the cluster of 3 articles that we have that are all about labor's response to artificial intelligence. Speaking of the hopefully soon to be changed criminal underration of New Labor Forum, we have a Twitter account now. So I would encourage everyone. Currently, it only has 1 follower, which is me. So you guys have the opportunity to get in on the ground floor of this thing. It's twitter.com/New Labor Forum or x.com/New Labor Forum. Please go to. I would even encourage you right now to pull out your phones. I wouldn't be mad at you if you're staring at your phones right now if you were going on Twitter to follow New Labor Forum. The one and only time I would ever encourage anyone to tweet is to follow New Labor Forum. And so I'm very happy to be joined today for this event by Alex Prest and Ed Anguiso Jr. I think they're 2 of the sharpest writers in the country, frankly, on their respective beats, on the labor movement and on technology. Very happy to have them here. Also, as we speak, I feel like we should mention that just blocks away from us right now, there are members of the New York Times Tech Guild that are out on the streets demanding the Times negotiate with them over a contract. They're threatening to strike on Election Day, which would be a massive blow to the Times' Election Day coverage, not to mention my own understanding of what the heck is going on out in the world on Tuesday. So, these issues are obviously of, very proximate importance in terms of what people are working on, people here at SLU, what they're working on, and, geographic proximity to us at this very, very moment. So to start with, I won't ask for a show of hands. I mentioned that these 2 are some of the best experts in their respective fields of writing critically about the labor movement, about technology. My job here, especially on the technology front, is to be the kind of dumb guy, because I am far from an expert on this, and I feel like that is probably true of many people in the audience about specifically this question of AI. Certainly lots of people have seen headlines that maybe have gotten them alarmed. Maybe they have played around with Chat GPT. Maybe they've spit out, 3,000-word essay through the use of ChatGPT. They think that's pretty cool. But fundamentally, I think a lot of people don't really understand just what AI is. The baseline definition. It's the kind of thing that gets tossed around a lot, but we don't necessarily take the time to spend what is on the biggest picture definitional level. What is artificial intelligence? So I wonder if, Ed, you could speak to that most basic dumb guy question that I have for you. Just tell us, what is artificial intelligence, and maybe some sort of top line issues of what its, sort of short and medium and long-term impact on society might be.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great question. I mean, especially because most of the people who are setting up the discussions about what artificial intelligence is or isn't are the firms that are trying to sell it to people and trying to convince people to integrate it into daily lives, or to convince managers to acquire it, discipline or control workforces, or governments trying to be sold it by vendors or militaries interested in purchasing it, right? So it is important to figure out what exactly it is that we're talking about. There's a book that came out recently called AI Snake Oil that has some problems with it, but it offers a really, really interesting thought experiment at the beginning that I think is helpful here, where, imagine a world where all types of vehicles, buses, cars, rockets going to the space station, airplanes are all just called vehicles. And when we talk about transportation or vehicles, we only say and talk about vehicle technology. We talk about how to handle the emissions of vehicle technology. We talk about what the safety standards for vehicle technology should be. We should talk about the specifications of whatever they travel on. And you can imagine that in such a world you have almost no idea of what anyone's actually talking about, because cars are different from buses, which are different from airplanes, which are different from trains, which are different from rocket ships, right? And so there'd be all sorts of scams and bullshit and, startups offering, ridiculous claims about what kind of vehicle technology you can have. And I say this is pretty much the world that we have with artificial intelligence. When we talk about artificial intelligence, we're usually conflating wildly different things. We're confusing systems that are automated systems that are used to predict things, to take data that's been generated in the past and make some decision about it, maybe to decide whether to grant someone bail, whether to, what insurance rates you should be charged on your vehicle, on your health care, to decide, whether or not you're committing welfare fraud, to decide, whether or not someone should be flagged for a secondary search and so security screening, right? You have forms of artificial intelligence that are about generating things, mimicking some aspect or passable aspect of human cognition, generating shitty essays and sentences and poems and prose through ChatGPT, generating art, generating video, generating simulacrums of these audio, visual content, and of which ChatGPT, Claude, Bard, or Bard by Google, OpenAI, ChatGPT, and Anthropic with Claude are like the major examples of. You also then have content moderation AI. This is another form that book offers that is like a helpful taxonomy to think about, which is maybe content moderation algorithms. Deciding whether or not you get banned for threatening to hurt a federal official or something like that on Twitter, or also deciding what content you get fed in the first place, whether you should be fed more videos or less videos of a certain type, figuring out how your likes and screen time and your follows and other information feed into what sort of content you should be shown. So, broadly speaking, we can think about AI as automated systems that are trying in one way or another to respond to human behavior, mold it, shape it, alter it. But also, more broadly than that, we can also think about the fact that artificial intelligence systems are also systems that, they're used to predict, they're used to surveil, they're used to control, they're used to modulate human behavior, and that can be, these kind of minuscule examples I used in consumer, business to business, security and other type of settings, but also, police, border authorities, militaries, hospitals, other sort of institutions where large decisions about people's lives, are being made, about their livelihood, about the mortality, about whether or not to control them, detain them, kill them, maim them, help them, or provide resources to help them are made, right? And I think, when we're talking about artificial intelligence and when we're hearing what firms are telling us, it's important to step back and say, like, these are people who are trying to sell a product that gives them unimpeachable and unaccountable control over how resources are allocated. And that's really what is at stake with AI.
No, I think that was a great answer. Yeah.
Ed, you've got a forthcoming piece in the New Republic on AI where you write that to understand AI and the ways that it might reshape society, we need to understand not just how and when it works, but who controls it and to what ends. And in another essay in The Nation last year, you wrote that Silicon Valley is the real threat, not AI. So those two things seem related. Can you explain what you meant in those two quotes? Why is the issue of AI, the bigger issue, the matter of who is controlling it and developing it rather than like something autonomous to the technology itself?
On one very simple level, it is concerning that Silicon Valley controls it because a lot of people in Silicon Valley are skull measuring freaks, right? They're deeply racist, reactionary. They have a long history of eugenics, and they're interested in figuring out ways to re-legitimize caste, re-legitimize pseudoscience, racial science, apartheid. These are people who believe in one way or another that you can use science, you can use statistical techniques and methods to figure out optimal demographic distribution for society and the resources that should be allocated, and that there's some people who are genetically superior, there's some people who deserve certain resources, there's some people who deserve certain support, and the only way we can really calibrate society that is innovating properly, developing properly, moving forward properly is with this sort of apartheid regime bolstered by scientific consensus instead of irrational racism, right?
Can I pause you for a second there? Because people who don't follow this stuff closely may think that you're making a sort of like hyperbolic, absurd statement. But you've written quite a bit about this, and there's lots of writing profiling some of these people in Silicon Valley. And by no stretch are you exaggerating what you just said. I mean, the sort of like, these are some of the most powerful people in society in the world right now. And a lot of them are really into these really insane, far-right, reactionary ideas. And it should probably worry us that such people who are some of the real power brokers of the world are so caught up in these kinds of really out there far-right ideas.
Yeah, I think the best. One of the best sources that's come out in a while about this is Malcolm Harris's Palo Alto, which is a history of capitalism in the world, but it's starts with California, going back to the original settling of it. And if you really just trace through the original networks and sources of wealth and institutions that housed people, whether it be Stanford University or the Hoover Institution over there, whether it be the cadre of individuals of racists, of eugenicists that's popped up around Leland, Stanford, and around original robber barons that developed, cultivated, and established a lot of the channels through which capital traveled in California. They're all obsessed with how do we optimize humans, but they paint that as we're optimizing them for the good of humanity, and that just means we have to purge the undesirable parts. And at different parts of different across history, that has looked and targeted and focused on specific races at specific times. But the method that they're interested in this era, I would say, is to some extent artificial intelligence and these attempts to sanitize and make objective old forms of discrimination and control. Right?
So I was interrupting you and I asked about how why it matters that you said Silicon Valley is the real threat, not AI. So what does that mean?
Yeah, I mean, what is Silicon Valley? Silicon Valley is an old center of wealth and power and privilege that sprung out of California in its history, and the mining industry, oil, and all sorts of channels for wealth that have flowed into there. But it also comes out of a very specific relationship with the military-industrial complex. The reason why Silicon Valley controlling artificial intelligence is concerning is because who decides where the money goes, who owns the resources, the intellectual property, the technical know-how, who decides what research initiatives are prioritized, who decides what products are constructed, who decides what sort of relationships consumers or individuals have with these products, what kind of products get offered to the public, what kind of products get offered to other businesses, what kind of products get offered to governments, shapes what we have to deal with. And if the dominant forces behind the funding, deployment, and design and development of artificial intelligence and other technologies are, on one hand, a sector of capitalists that are obsessed with eugenics, and on the other hand, the military-industrial complex, then what you get is artificial intelligence that is, what we have, obsessed with social control, obsessed with surveillance, obsessed with prediction, obsessed with, efficiency in one way or another, or either making obsolete labor in certain groups of workers, or figuring out how. Was it good? Oh, I thought it cut off. Making some workers obsolete, figuring out how not to allocate resources to some social groups, figuring out how to preserve power and privilege and inequality. I mean, these are all outcomes that don't congeal with the narrative that these companies give, which is AI is for the future. AI is going to help make us more productive, more efficient. It's going to free us from leisure. Actually, if you just look at the power dynamics and if you look at the history of who's funding it and why they're funding it, you see they're more interested in preserving and worsening things as they are. I mean, which is beneficial for them, right? That makes a better future. If you're a funder, if you're a big tech company, if you're a military vendor, if you are a venture capitalist, if you're a billionaire, but it's a worse off development for every single one of us otherwise.
Alex, you can feel free to answer this too. I felt like at the most top line level in society, you know, what does AI mean to the average person at this point? Maybe not very much, but if they have interacted with it, as I mentioned before, it's like ChatGPT, and it's sort of like a magical thing that can produce, you know, whatever you want. It can spit out your English comp term paper in mere seconds if you give it the right commands or whatever, and that's pretty neat. And wow, amazing to live in the 21st century. But you were just getting at what the actual uses of this technology at this point are, which again, widely variegated technology, but like on the whole, what this kind of technology is being used for is sort of greater strategies of profit accumulation, surveillance, war making, et cetera. And it almost feels like something like a chat GPT is like an effective PR campaign who, you know, once people have a technology like that in their hands that's so powerful and so magical, who would want to take it away? Why would you want to stifle that with any kind of government regulation when that could sort of serve as a fig leaf for these more nefarious forms of social control and oppression and surveillance that you just mentioned, that are like the bulk of what is being done with that technology at this point?
Yeah, I'll just jump in and say, I mean, it's an incredible PR coup. It's like the best bait and switch you can imagine. For all the criticisms I'm sure anyone who teaches in the room has of ChatGPT, for example, making your life kind of a headache and hell in certain ways. At the same time, Ed did a great job of explaining that AI technology is so often being used to, you know, it's municipal uses. We were talking before we started about the Israeli military is using projects like Lavender and Where's Daddy to sort of map out, you know, who to kill, create kill lists, no regard for accuracy. Not that an accurate kill list is a thing that exists. That makes sense. But this is what the tools are, and they are based in, you know, the ownership of this nucleus of rich racist billionaires, Silicon Valley, which, you know, Ed didn't mention in the kind of the long history of Silicon Valley. One aspect of it, why early tech companies started there was they were evading the East Coast unions, which, you know, the labor movement when Intel was setting up shop outside of Boston, you know, there were labor unions there and they went west. You know, the CEO of Intel at the time said very explicitly, we're here to evade unions. This nucleus, you know, if that's the product, this is of course the result. I think AI, it's interesting in that it's, you know, probably the best, most effective PR campaign I can think of as far as a technology that's incredibly damaging and kind of evil, but also just looks like a fun tool that you can use while you're doing your homework. At the same time, I think the political kind of coalition that you just laid out almost makes it so straightforward, whereas in the past, you know, when we talked about, you know, Silicon Valley's relationship to DARPA, the military wing of like science and technology funding that helped create the internet, you know, you had to really dig and explain. Now you just have Peter Thiel like funding the most racist politicians in the country. You have Elon Musk, you know, sort of out there doing the same. Both of those figures also, you mentioned apartheid regime, you know, interestingly themselves were in apartheid South Africa in their youth. You know, it's a really easy to make argument about why these are not the people that should be controlling these technologies. And while technology always has some liberatory potential, this is so baked in at every level, these kind of like this ranking of what matters, this desire to profit and judge and surveil and kill, that it really makes it easy, I think, to understand that like AI would have to be very much reimagined for it to be kind of this liberating tool that we then are presented with as, oh, it's just going to make your job less tedious. You know, you're not going to have to code as much or something like that.
So we're in the School of Labor and Urban Studies. I want to focus this conversation on labor in just a second. But first, you know, in general, I'm always thinking about how new technologies are rolled out in our society in the 21st century. And it's sort of insane that there is a complete lack of democratic input that any of us have on these technologies that come to dominate our lives. Like, none of us were consulted on whether or not we wanted like this thing to like ping us every 3 seconds and like, you know, shatter our attention spans and have our social media accounts through which we live our lives in the 21st century hoover up all of this data. The list goes on and on of things that none of us were ever consulted about. They were just sort of foisted upon us, and within a very short amount of time, it's like, well, now this is the norm for society. If you want to participate in society like a normal person in the 21st century, you must use these platforms. You must use these kinds of technologies. And that's sort of bonkers. I mean, there's no level of democratic consultation that goes into any aspect of like technological development, you know, beyond the sort of like supposed democracy of the marketplace where you vote with your dollars, you buy the Samsung phone instead of the iPhone because you like its features better or something like that. I mean, this and like that's not even up for discussion in society at this point about whether or not this is going to change. Like, this is not anything that any politician of any stripe ever seems to really bring up. So I just before we get into the specifics about labor, I just wanted to state that there's like this contempt for democracy in the stuff of our daily lives that seems baked into how these technologies have developed themselves. And maybe it's not a coincidence that maybe the people who are overseeing the development of these things also, as you two have mentioned, have a real contempt for other kinds of democracy in society.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the whole Silicon Valley business model is, you know, one or a significant part of it is we have, you know, venture capitalists. We have individuals with large hoards of money who are either managing other people's money or have it themselves. They're not interested in getting taxed on it, and so they take advantage of loopholes to invest it into firms that they'll, you know, leverage that money into an equity stake that also itself is going to be deferred on taxation. And they use that to inflate the valuation of the firm so that they can then cash out at a later point, use that money to then lobby for more friendly economic regulations that suit themselves. But also that the venture capital model of trying to soak up the money that these people are pouring into it lends itself towards narrowing the type of technologies that are pursued, right? Because now what are you pursuing? You're pursuing some sort of app that is capable of scaling, becoming a monopoly, or, you know, potentially a monopoly that then also has to be structured in such a way that it has to pay a significant amount of its cost to renting computational resources from one of the big tech companies, right? That has to have some sort of orientation towards a consumer or product provision, or maybe some, you know, bullshit business to business provision. So it narrows the types of products that we get, and it turns everything into a product. It operates with the premise that, you know, the real problem here is not really how can we develop a technology that maybe helps with some problem, yes, but also doesn't have to be a permanent, persistent feature of your life, into how can we make a perpetually growing market and capture a larger share of it, so that we can either be the dominant actor or so that we can get acquired by a dominant actor, right? That's not, if you're interested in, if any of us were interested in designing a technological system, we would not sit down and say, how can we make one that benefits shareholders the most or investors the most? You know, we would be more concerned with particular socially beneficial outcomes, and the economic outcomes would be secondary, third, tertiary, you know, or maybe not even concerned at all. We have a dysfunctional system because it prioritizes profits of, you know, this coalition that we've been talking about.
And then, I mean, to segue into labor itself, I mean, and then workers often, you know, become this canary in the coal mine, as this piece lays out in New Labor Forum, about like being the first hit and the best organized to kind of respond, since there's no other democratic input. There's no like forum where people can go and say, I don't want this technology. Unions can sort of stop and say, hey, this is going to do problems. But what a crap deal, because by that point, it's already, you're already being hit with this technology that has been at every level developed to have, with no workers, no public, no democratic input in mind at all, no socially beneficial outcomes being considered beyond profit. And so then, this is it's a really thorny thing for unions, and there's a range of responses unions have had to this, to try to grapple with, like, what do you do when you're handed like just garbage and you're told this is the new normal? Are you okay with it? And that is, I think we've seen a range of responses from labor. I assume you want to get into that now.
Yeah, so that's what Alex's piece in New Labor Forum is about organized labor's response to this. But before we do that, I wanted to ask you both how you see this technology in the broader historical sweep of technological advancements that have impacted labor in the modern era. Like, is this some qualitatively new phase that we've entered into with AI technology, or is this just sort of like the latest iteration of technology that is that introduces some socially beneficiary, has some socially beneficiary potential, but is largely used to undercut worker power, to make workers' lives worse, to lay workers off from their jobs, to cause mass social displacement and upheaval. So where do you place this in the larger sweep of technology and the workforce?
I mean, I'm not surprised that, and Ed is one of the representatives of this, that there's been like a slight growth in interest in Luddism, sort of that history. Ned Ludd at the early stage of industrialization in the UK. There was the movement of workers who, as new technology was introduced into the early factories, just brought, basically hammers and just destroyed the machines. This Machine Kills being Ed's podcast. It's basically the same, except now you can't hit AI with a hammer. I would say, again, like, the history of technology is always one that the key question is who is owning and controlling and developing this. And so I see it as very much just the latest iteration. Maybe, we have to talk about a new level of scale, which is always true with, the kind of the exponential growth of technology in the modern era, that it's always scaling up now. So that, in that respect, it's different. But, technology, I think there are, just like machines in the Luddist era could have been used to actually make work less debilitating, less, murderous at the time, but it wasn't. Similarly, now we can imagine, AI that would be used actually in a way, or some level, some type of the taxonomy Ed was using, some version of that technology that might, without destroying the planet's resources at the same time, which is an open question with AI, which is using just immense amounts of water and energy. We can imagine, the tedious tasks of an administrative assistant being made easier with a automated algorithm. We can imagine, fast food work that maybe was made a little easier as far as ringing up customers and putting orders in and moving them along. That wouldn't be as bad. But as it stands now, this is technology that is being used to displace workers and to, instead of a worker not existing anymore, not having a job, now their job is to like oversee an automated algorithm in a way that is very familiar in the history of labor struggles, that we know that in the past when machines were introduced into the workplace, all of a sudden you had a new layer of like quasi-managerial strata that just had to oversee the machines that were constantly breaking down, and AI is constantly misgenerating output, and now people's jobs is to just tend the algorithm.
Yeah, no, I would say, there's a book that came out, I think, last year that kind of talks about this, Power and Progress, about how, there are a lot of myths about technological progress, that the gains always filter down to everybody, that technologies are initially expensive at first, but, the cost level out eventually, and that makes adoption easier for everyone. I mean, most of those initially right off the bat don't apply to artificial intelligence. As we can see, it's an incredibly expensive technology that the costs are not lowering in a way that's commensurate with increased gains for people, because they're being concentrated and applied by a small cadre of individuals and firms that are looking to advance certain political projects and certain relationships with vendors, with governments, and with the public as well, to make them subservient on the product itself. But also, to Alex's point, it's like, what would this technology look like if we were actually interested in ends that had little to do with profit and inflating the value so that an investor can get a huge payday? Would we, ChatGPT is an example, right? Where instead of generating essays, you could imagine some alternative that is more concerned with augmenting your ability to, overlook and edit and understand the text that you wrote, right? Is there any interest in doing that? No, because it doesn't incentivize you to keep using it and generate more and more reliance on the service itself, right? So part of the problem with this, and that I think is also a little bit more unique with artificial intelligence as we currently suffer it, is that it's being constructed with the help of hundreds of billions and likely trillions soon of dollars in such a way that it compels the user to rely on it more and more, governments to rely on it more and more when they're interfacing it into the health authorities or into their library systems or into their militaries, as ours is now doing, or into their border authorities. It incentivizes users to use it more and more as they're trying to generate essays, as they're trying to, pass it off for their own thinking instead of, just sitting down with themselves and maybe writing something or to cut corners on something, right? That the actual beneficial uses of it are increasingly obscured because the intentional goal is more consumption, monopolization of that consumption, reliance on that consumption, and then hiking the price eventually, as they've been slowly doing with the service. So I think here, even though it's the same with most tech, which is that unless there's pretty forceful intervention from workers in the state to regulate it, it's going to be exploitative. There's also an added element where, because of how successful the PR has been, I think they'll be able to worm themselves into a lot of institutions before anything's done, really.
I just want to add, as far as the encouragement of over-reliance and more reliance on this, I was interviewing a worker at an anonymous big tech company who, was involved basically in content moderation. And he was telling me, he was kind of in a managerial process. He was in part of trying to hire new members for the team. And they were hiring, as many of these companies do, Indian workers in India who would just, remotely work. And this would be about content moderation of a ChatGPT-like tool, and kind of like training that tool. And he was telling me, I had to work all weekend without being paid. He was poorly paid worker, contract worker, as the majority of a lot of these tech workers at these big companies are. He said, I had to work all weekend because I realized that these workers themselves were using ChatGPT to do their essays to prove to me that, because like English language was a requirement of the job and, certain kind of like competency questions around understanding the tool. And it occurred to him halfway through the hiring process that like, oh, these are being generated with AI. And so he was on his off time trying to figure out how to weed out and identify which ones were AI generated resumes and assisted. And I was just like, this is it's comical. There's no end to this now. And I feel like that anecdote will always stick out to me. It's like, oh, it's almost too late in some ways.
So Alex, can you get into some concrete examples of what the imposition of these technologies is looking like in American workplaces in 2024?
Yeah, so, I think like many people in the labor movement, I also didn't really understand much about AI. And, I'd been paying some attention to it and stuff, but it really was brought home to me when the writers and actors in Hollywood went on strike, I guess now last summer. That is the canary in the coal mine, I think, as far as it finally coming to people's attention, myself included. There it looks like an actor I was talking to on the picket line who used to host a TV show. And so there's lots and lots of footage of her. And she was like, I'm very genuinely concerned that, now that an AI tool is going to be trained on me and there's so much footage that I can create an AI generated version of me to host shows in perpetuity, online, digitally, saying things I never said, doing things I never did. No one will be able to tell the difference. I mean, this is really, this is not only insecurity around, I guess like an obvious thing of what if they make me say and do something I would never do. And, many of this deep fake technology is basically non-consensual porn. But also, just fundamentally, it's theft of voice and body, right? And so in Hollywood, there's this concern that this becomes, a really kind of extreme, this is quite literally a Black Mirror plot. And writers the same way, that they'll be given kind of chat GPT produced scripts and told to kind of improve upon, again, oversee the algorithm, try to fix up this garbage and make it into gold. And so how those two unions responded to it, they differ a little bit in what they want. I think fundamentally when we're thinking about all the different union responses here, there's just a basic question that I think is a good thing in the labor movement, that this is being taken on, that technology now is being seen as something at the bargaining table, right? AI, in part because of the hype of this is revolutionary, this is going to change everything, has led, I think, a lot of workers and a lot of union leadership to actually realize that this has to be bargained over. And so, the Writers Guild won slightly stronger protections on AI ultimately. There, it was around, writers cannot be given a script that is AI generated. They can't be forced to, sort of use Chat GPT in their own work. That said, I've spoken to writers who, are explaining how this is immediately being kind of evaded, right? Like, writers are being told in the union, if they ask you to use AI, like, don't take that job. A lot of the time, the company, I was talking to a worker who was like, yeah, I didn't take a job because they were trying to push AI on us. Turns out that they realized, the person who did take that job, they realized the AI didn't work, so it's just a regular job. I should have taken it. And it's just like, right, okay. So it's a constant headache. There are other approaches here. So Microsoft and CWA have a very unusual partnership that they announced last year. Microsoft is behind, is one of the key players in the AI kind of boom. And so it's very interesting that they have partnered with the existing union. The partnership is supposed to entail neutrality for workers organizing at Microsoft in any division. Microsoft workers, particularly now in a sort of video game subsidiary, have unionized, and that was the impetus. They're with CWA for this. And Microsoft said, also, so we'll be neutral towards organizing. We will also take input and kind of do a joint partnership of sorts about the use and development of future AI technology. I think a lot of people in the room know that when you're given a joint committee with the boss, often they'll hear you and see you, but it's not affecting what they're actually doing at the end of the day. And I think it's very clear that that's probably what's going on with Microsoft and CWA. This looks very good for Microsoft. I have questions as well around, I've heard from workers at CWA as well that Microsoft is respecting the neutrality for the video game unit. They are not being neutral on other organizing efforts. So again, this unfortunately seems to yet again be just another, there's no way to kind of collaborate with the management on this tool. And then, as far as other existing unions, the AFL-CIO, the federation, they have taken an approach of they're sort of pro, I think, this sort of CWA approach on this, of demanding more public input. I mean, to your point, there's really a need for that. As Micah was saying, we have no input on this at the current time. That said, what that is looking like is, Liz Schuler, the president of the AFL-CIO, took some Unite Here members to CMU, Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, where a lot of this technology is being developed. And they sort of had a focus group. There were bus drivers as well that were taken to explain why AI technology would be bad for them. And then they the scientists and researchers were like, wow, I never considered that. Okay. Like, and that is what it's looking like, boil it down and simplify a little. But, that is, I think there's still a grappling with approaches. Some journalists, you mentioned the New York Times Tech Guild is practicing for a strike right now. Some journalists have won, protections against the use of AI at the bargaining table. The Financial Times unit just won that. I think it's interesting that FT is the one that got that, because they might be the ones that actually understand that this is a labor-saving device, and so they don't want it in their workplace.
Ed, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I think that, the most immediate place that we can think about fighting, resisting, or trying to structure artificial intelligence is in these workplaces, right? Because here there is, as you're saying, like attempts to build up some sort of response mechanism that can be used as a deterrent for other firms or for other workplaces, right? That a victory with a writers' union, a victory with the news union, a victory with other sorts of workplaces can help send a message to firms and vendors that are trying to push artificial intelligence everywhere that they probably shouldn't, or inspire workers that are suffering through it right now to try to organize against it in one way or another. Because otherwise, a lot of people over the past 2 years have had it rolled out and integrated into the workforce, and surveys constantly find that it's not actually improving their productivity. It's a headache because you have to spend a significant amount of time either fact-checking the output or learning this new interface that is, non-functional a lot of the time, and so maybe you just go around it in one way or another, or some forms of sabotage because they're not interested in actually integrating it and don't want to encourage wider adoption of it, or again because you have to spend a lot of time figuring out what is. How much of what it's saying is actually accurate or correct. So I think that we'll see in the labor movement, and that we're seeing in the labor movement, I think some of the more exciting developments here, because in governments and in large sprawling private and public partnerships that are integrating the use of artificial intelligence, there's a naive approach where they kind of just more or less believe what the firms are saying. Giving OpenAI the keys to the city, with various public health authorities, like the NHS is, in the United Kingdom has been collaborating with Palantir to try to optimize or make more efficient their healthcare system and the provision of the healthcare system with artificial intelligence, right? So allowing and integrating predictive AI and increasingly generative AI is something that a lot of firms, a lot of institutions that are concerned with efficiency are going to do. The more public they are, the more opportunity there are to resist, but also at the same time, because of the lack of funding for so many of our institutions, because of the neoliberal logic that's a lot of them are embedded within, in which they are trying to figure out how do we do more with less, they are going to adopt haphazardly these programs, even if they don't work, sadly.
I just want to add, not to be too depressing, though I'm sure we're painting a really bleak vision.
Too late.
Bleak vision up here. Is, it's fundamentally the case that unionized workers who actually have a tool at their disposal, are some of the only people in the American public who actually have any way to have a say over this. At the same time, this is technology that is being rolled out at incredible speed at a time of just a historic disorganization among the American working class, weakness in the American labor movement. The vast majority of workers are not in a union, right? And they're sort of reliant on the very small number of workers who are union members to sort of be doing something on their behalf, basically, by trying to stop this. And I just, when I think about, call center workers, for example, are some of the most this is where this technology has been especially rolled out, and it has led to some layoffs, a lot of more just these now even more annoying jobs. If a call center job could get more annoying, where you also now are using a chat bot that isn't working or is saying offensive stuff to the person you're interfacing with. And so you can imagine how this becomes a problem with you at work. These are largely non-union workers, a lot of them. A lot of workers, we think about rideshare drivers, and Uber and Lyft is, I think, a really good kind of parallel recent example of the mass kind of invasion of a technology into the public, and before it's kind of a done deal before you realize what's happening, and then it's too late. Society is reliant on it. Non-union workers. And I just, the fact that this is happening at a time where workers are just being subjected to this like it's a force of nature, and have no means at their disposal, no collective bargaining agreement, no organization, no way to fight back, and no one to even speak up on their behalf, I think is just something we all have to be very honest with ourselves about.
In Jason Resnikoff's piece in this issue of New Labor Forum, he talks about the essentialness of what you just said about not seeing this technology as some kind of force of nature that is just, automatic. It's just being rolled out, as on the tides of capital H history, and there's really not much that we can do to stop it. It is both empirically not true. There are actual forces there are people behind the rollout of this, and they can be persuaded to do one thing or another in terms of what the technology actually looks like. And also, if you see this kind of technological implementation as just being natural, then that's disempowering for the forces that do exist that are able to stand up and, in the case of the labor movement, like actually make kind of democratic input that we were talking about before that is lacking for other workers and for the rest of society. There actually are democratic avenues for real live people to intervene and say, no, we don't want this technology to look like this. We don't want this kind of displacement in the workforce or erosion of our basic working conditions or this kind of surveillance of us. It is indeed possible to accomplish that if we don't see this as some sort of like naturally occurring phenomenon. It's something that we can intervene in.
Yeah, I think there's also a lot of energy spent in trying to naturalize it so that people forget about how viciously people have resisted previous attempts to foist technologies onto them over the past few decades. I mean, in the late 60s and 70s, as part of attempts to integrate universities, institute Black Studies programs, I mean, students were taking over physical computer centers and blowing them up, and setting the computer cards on fire and destroying the property, or threatening to destroy the property as part of their demands. The targeting of computational infrastructure. I mean, there was an attempt. At one point, they blew up some of the, as part of the protests of the Vietnam War, they blew up offices in the Pentagon that were, integral to doing missile defense in Vietnam. I mean, there's the attempts to naturalize this and say this is a force of history, and if you're standing astride of it, you are, in the way of progress in your child, or, you don't really know what's going on, or in one way or another, you're actually causing more harm than you might expect, are attempts to forget that a lot of the success and a lot of the more enjoyable contours of life that we have come from pretty insistent and militant forms of resistance to these things, right? And that once you if you accept that it's not a historical thing and it's a material thing, then that's one step removed from being like, okay, and there are places that can be sites of resistance or targets, right? Maybe not data centers because they're pretty well protected, but other parts of the computational infrastructure are relatively vulnerable, and it would not take much for a place, a workplace, a hospital, a university that's interested in slowing down the adoption of them for students to come in and fundamentally undermine the operations by occupying some place or disrupting the operation of some place, right? So keeping in mind the material element of it is integral to also figuring out how do we resist it. What are the weak points? What are the pressure points? Who can be convinced and who can be scared, and what can be destroyed or what can be defaced, so on and so forth.
I want to move to questions. I had more about the labor movement, but we've got three that are all about labor, so I'm going to go to some of these. One from Joel, who's an AFT staffer. Direct care in healthcare would be difficult to automate, but what is on the horizon with AI in healthcare? Either of you can answer that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure we both have things to say. I mean, just on a sort of vague scale, like, I mean, this is being used by hospitals and municipal systems to, as Ed said, like, these are algorithms that are then being used to figure out, are you committing welfare fraud? Should your health insurance rates go up? In hospitals, so much of what workers do in a hospital is just like, doing the notes, like putting all of the information into the system, check every end of every shift, right? Every worker's doing that for their rounds. This is where AI, I think, in one respect, can be used to track patients. I mean, we all know that hospitals are so incredibly bureaucratic, so it's a prime sort of place for that. I think it's totally true that home health aides, nurses, I mean, healthcare workers writ large in general, can't be automated. That said, they can be forced to deal with this awful technology as they're doing their rounds in ways that have really concrete and very high stakes, given that we're talking about people's health and safety and lives. And so I'd say, I don't think it has been like I don't know about the specifics of deployment as far as in hospitals, for instance, in the United States, beyond just like particularly the automated systems around like tracking patient kind of care and updates.
Yeah, I think one way to think about it is how Uber and Lyft were used to degrade labor conditions for ride-hail workers, right? Under the guise of a transportation network company, right? Taxi dispatch service with an app, you're able to exempt yourself from labor conditions, misclassify your workers. You don't have to pay them insurance, or you don't have to pay into unemployment insurance. You don't have to provide health care. You don't have to, provide, minimum wage. You don't have to provide safe working conditions. This opens up exploitation to further drive down labor costs and maximize productivity of them. Right, you can maximize the idle time of these drivers. You can use them to manipulate supply and demand so that the prices are low in periods where they shouldn't otherwise be, so that consumers use the app more and more, and then hike them later on. Right. So by rolling out or by pretending to or insisting that you're actually digitizing or integrating automated systems, that opens up the door for you to exploit the labor supply, that it opens the door for you to also fleece the people who are reliant on the service, right, who are buying it, because, they are trying to take care of a loved one, maybe. They're trying to, either a loved one who's in a facility or a loved one at home that needs care, right? So I think that, if you're looking at this, be very, the comparisons to Uber and Lyft are very important, especially in California, where after they were successful with killing AB5, venture capitalists were celebrating because they're like, well, we've been, we've used this as a battering ram, we've used this as a Trojan horse, and now we can start using misclassification strategies and regulatory arbitrage to new industries that deal with workers who we can conceivably say are not actually employees, because now we're automating part of the scheduling. Now we're automating part of the labor assignment, and we can use this algorithmic oversight to manufacture distance between us and the worker, but actually have even tighter control over their rates, over their scheduling, over their deployment, so that we can pay less for them.
Yeah, I think I just want to underline that point, because it is definitely the case that as the mediator, this sort of idea of a platform for home health aides or nurses very much is like a real conversation in California right now after AB5, where healthcare workers are saying that this is a thing that not only, sort of I think the legal, like it gives the companies legal, plausible deniability to say, like, what if you're hiring a home health aide on Uber for nurses? Well, then that nurse isn't an employee, and that home health aide actually is just using the app for their gig work, and who cares that they're now getting even less money, and they're also exempt from protections. I mean, we know that the home health care sector is already incredibly rife with exploitation and abuse, and now imagine if there also just were no employers at all, and these workers were told they were kind of, exploiting themselves for the sake of freedom. And I think that is really what's happening. And And so that's something that definitely I would say, as far as beyond just the bureaucracy, and because to me, when I think healthcare work and AI, I think about like hospital systems that are now even less accurate and even more annoying. But it's totally true that also when I think like home health aides and things like that being used via hired and surveilled via algorithm is a huge area of concern.
Chris from the News Guild asks, what would a strong AI contract provision look like? I would love a full ban on use on AI, but that seems like a very difficult thing to win. Alex, maybe this is a question for you, given that this is the kind of stuff that you write about in your new labor reform piece.
Yeah, I'm pulling it up because I'm like, I'm sure I have the FT's provision quoted in this piece. I mean, I think they won a full, like, it's mandatory bargain. It's a mandatory, the company cannot, at FT, management cannot introduce any AI technology without first getting approval from the workers. So it's basically a ban. And I would say that is very strong provision. There are very weak provisions that are happening at News Guild shops, I think included. I'm not sure about that. Don't yell at me, Chris. Like a lot of these companies like are striking deals with OpenAI and other places that are allowing these companies to train their technology on headlines, whether it's at the New York Times or Vox or the Atlantic. They're like getting a big chunk of money to give them access to these archives, this data that then the tools are being trained on. As if this is not just immediately going to undermine the workers' jobs. I mean, the workers are not getting any money for that; it's the companies. And I think it's a real question why there are union shops where this is happening. I'm sure workers there are fighting it. I would be curious, Chris, what's going on there, because I do think that like. This is like management is the enemy here. Management is caving again and again. Like we know that just because their bosses are running a media company doesn't mean they care about like journalism or accuracy or ethics. And we're seeing it again and again by them taking this pot of gold, this like poison pill from Microsoft, say, to hand over the entirety of their work, which again, these companies own that intellectual property. I mean, this is another concern that the Writers Guild actually won in the Hollywood contracts. As far as like intellectual property rights are being violated. The New York Times actually is suing one of these companies for violating intellectual property. So my bad, they weren't one of the ones that struck a deal. They're one of the only ones that are actually trying to protect the journalists and their own kind of like rights over their information, which instead is being stolen and used to train for future stealing.
Yeah, I want to add on that this is, more or less a repeat of what happened with the pivot to video, right? What's happening with, news companies believing firms that lied to them about how if you do this thing that congeals exactly with our business model, you'll find yourself more flush with cash that we took from you when we were figuring out how to monopolize advertising or digital advertising, right? So one thing I'm also confused by is like why the management each time believes the same lie, because in many instances it's the same people who were lied to about all the various pivots that would come, or the pivots that they needed to make when they wanted to replenish revenue that they lost from Facebook and Google monopolizing search. Monopolizing digital advertising, right? That if they just did this or that change, they would be able to replenish some of it, and then they would make the pivot. The revenue wouldn't materialize. They would then be reliant on grants and partnerships with these firms, which would then be yanked out of them at the earliest convenience. And that is almost certainly what's going to happen with these OpenAI deals, right? There's no, this guy, Sam Altman is someone who, when you really listen to him and talk with him, it's blowing smoke out of his ass most of the time. And
explain who Sam Altman is.
Oh, Sam Altman is the chief executive and founder of OpenAI, which is responsible for ChatGPT and has been, kind of using his firm as a platform and a battering ram to advance the idea that most of society needs to wake up and start making deals with generative AI companies so that they can be ahead of everyone when the flood comes and these these products automate away their job or automate away their livelihood, and has been advocating for these deals as well as for political projects that benefit himself, like universal basic income, so that some of the money can also be funneled into OpenAI as a subscription.
I just want to add, as far as for specifics and to underline that point. So it's the media companies, to Chris's question again, that have inked deals with OpenAI and Microsoft include Vox Media, News Corp, which is the publisher of the Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, and FT. So again, this is like becoming a proxy war, in that then FT journalists immediately get in and prioritize getting in writing. And I talked for this piece in New Labor Forum, which you can subscribe to, et cetera, et cetera. The FT Guild, so they said that the guy David Eisenberg, one of the workers on the bargaining committee, explained to me that, so at first the company wanted to limit again to giving workers the right to discuss the introduction of new technology like AI, and the members held out to demand that a mandate to bargain over any introduction of newly introduced technology, and the contract includes that language.
Is there would that you say that is the strongest provision that you,
as far as journalists? Yeah.
I mean, is that the model, like the best case scenario that you're aware of in terms of unions negotiating over this?
I mean, again, like it looks different in different industries. Like the Writers Guild is the closest in as far as Hollywood stuff. Unite here in Las Vegas has won the right to like retraining if new technology is introduced that like displaces workers from hotel jobs on the Vegas Strip, for example. So that is a different provision. It just looks different everywhere. But as far as journalists, which again, it's like that is another canary in the coal mine because their work is being used to train so much of this technology. And also it's just such a, Sports Illustrated had this embarrassing scandal recently where it was revealed that they basically just had an AI journalist and they were just producing just garbage. And there's just, anytime AI is used to produce an article, it just contains so many inaccuracies in addition to just bad writing. And so this is another case where, I think the workers are seeing that this really, no one else is stopping. Journalists are the only ones the union journalists are the only ones who can stop it from all of a sudden every article being just completely made up garbage, which so much is anyway. So it's yet another case where like workers, as on so many issues, from the environment to discrimination, workers are becoming the front line that can kind of raise the alarm about the effects of this in every sort of capacity and vein.
So related to your last point, a question from Paul Son from the National Employment Law Project. The best way to regulate AI and surveillance in the workplace is at the bargaining table, but for the majority of the private sector workforce, not in unions, we need to develop regulatory structures. Labor and civil society groups are only slowly beginning to develop proposals and campaigns for doing so. Do you have any advice for that emerging movement, either of you?
Ideally I would want a full ban on predictive AI at the very least, and a freeze on generative AI and other forms of AI, because like you raised, we need a regulatory framework. We do have a set of institutions that could work, but they're underfunded and understaffed, right? You could imagine it would be relatively easy to get the DOJ, the Department of Justice, the Consumer Protection Bureau, and Federal Trade Commission, with more funding and more staffing, to go after firms that are trading in surveillance. The FTC already did this earlier, where across the past 3 years, they've been able to successfully get a bunch of firms whose business models were surveillance to delete their algorithms, delete the data sets, delete and destroy products and services that were related to these surveillance models, right? So I think that there are some tools that are capable, but we need to build them up more massively, and also have to agitate against the idea and undermine the idea that prediction, especially with artificial intelligence, is possible. I mean, so much of this also comes out of the idea that people think or believe that if you just know more information about a person, you can figure out what to do next. If you're a business, right? Figure out what to sell them next, figure out what to put in front of them next. and there's little to no evidence that that's possible, specifically with predictive artificial intelligence. And yet, because of this persistent myth, it is rolled out anywhere. And part of that is also a function of the fact that like so much of the digital economy relies on advertising, right? So there's also a sort of like self-fulfilling prophecy or bullshit around it, where people are insisting that this thing that is sitting at the core of the digital economy and is more or less the reason why so much of it is free or low cost, is connected to a functional thesis, which is that if you have more data on people, you can predict it, but you can't. So I don't think we'll make progress on undermining surveillance unless we also undermine this idea that you can make predictions about people so that you can better allocate resources to them. But once we do that and start funding and staffing some of these regulatory agencies, that can be like a basic first step. I think the further routes, imagining alternative AI, total ban of surveillance, freezing most other forms of artificial intelligence and their integration into public institutions will take as part of a larger conversation about what we want to do with technology. And do we just want it to be optimizing and making us more efficient? Do we just want it to fit into bureaucratic logic, or are we interested in experimenting with it in ways that don't just lend themselves towards you being a better entrepreneur, a better producer, a better worker, right? And what would that even look like?
Yeah, I mean, and I would just add that just if they're just keeping in mind at all times, just denaturalizing that this is inevitability and that you just need to tinker around the edges, which again, I do feel like is how much of the conversation is going, in every sector that is trying to respond, but certainly within labor too, is just kind of a sense of like, okay, this is inevitable. It can't be stopped. A ban is impossible. What would it look like if like every 6 months, one bus driver got to talk to one software engineer at Microsoft? Like that is a non-starter as a solution. And I think as we're forming coalitions, as we're forming organizations, and understanding that the regulations are so lacking, that's an uphill battle. Just a constant sense of like, again, this kind of thinking that Ed is laying out of like, what would it look like to actually question this technology entirely? What would it look like to actually start thinking about like, if it were up to workers to figure out what are the parts of my job that are tedious, what are the ways I could imagine it looking different given the immense wealth and prosperity and money in this country and in this world, what would that technology look like? And then compare that to what AI is actually offering. I think there's just a constant, because normally I wouldn't think like, these things are that important, but because we're just it's a deluge of like advertising and PR. It's really important to keep this stuff in mind, that like it does not have to be this way, and you don't have to accept it as like as sort of the beginning of being serious as a coalition or something like that.
We have a little less than 15 minutes left. We can also take questions from the mic. Yeah, we can go over here.
He's had his hand up a while.
Sure. Over there. While the mic's coming over there, I have one maybe quick question for Ed. This wouldn't have to be quick, but try to make it quick. Obviously we're talking about the need for labor to bargain over this stuff in order to determine the terms of how AI is imposed on society. You all were just saying we shouldn't be tinkering around the edges. Does that mean, Ed, I mean, you've alluded to the sort of like tongue-in-cheek like affinity for Luddism, which is fundamentally like a very blunt statement. You're like, no, we're not taking this. We don't want this. Zero of it. None of it. We're standing here and got both our hands up and we're not interested in any of it. Do you see that as like a good strategic stance for like the labor movement, for example, to take, to not say like we're here to sit down and rationally negotiate with you, but like a middle finger to the bosses about the imposition of this technology? And then, of course, you're probably not going to get zero implementation of that technology, but taking that obstinate stance against it is actually like in the best interest of workers in terms of eventually reaching a deal that is more beneficial to them than not.
Yeah, there has to be a radical flank. There has to be an additional cost to business as usual, I think. At large, sabotage should be a strategy incorporated more because we need an additional cost to capital if the state isn't going to provide it, right? I think a lot about the argument that Andreas Moll makes with the climate movement and how to blow up a pipeline, which is itself just an argument about the limits of non-violent action that avoids property destruction, right? If the state is colluding and invested in the interest of this firm and this industry that has such socially odious outcomes, how can we make it more expensive for business as usual, so that then we can force some sort of crack or rupture to emerge that maybe necessitates intervention that follows the more moderate demands, right? So I think for the labor movement, similarly, right, there's a lot of opportunity there. There's a lot of vulnerability there, in a lot of, as I said, in computational infrastructure more generally, but also in places that are experimenting with it, foisting it onto their students, onto their to their patients, onto their citizens, onto their subjects, right? So yeah, I definitely think that Luddism is, at the end of the day, the Luddites weren't just destroying every single mill that they came across. They were destroying specifically the mills that were being used to undermine people's livelihoods, right? So it's not about destroying everything. It's about targeting it so that there's a clear message being sent and that there's an increased cost to business as usual. And whatever that looks like is, up to the movement itself, but that has to be entertained as it's clearly, it's becoming clear that we're hurtling towards a disaster here. Right.
I just want to add, as yet another thing just to think about as we leave, maybe, so I won't talk too long. Just, we just saw the very brief dock worker strike on the East Coast. And, the ILA, the International Longshore Association, is the East Coast Longshore Union. The West Coast is the ILWU. They've taken two very different approaches to technology, the introduction of technology. Longshoremen, this has been it's a union where technology, changes in technology from the containerization revolution up to the present, has been front and center of negotiations every time. And on the West Coast, the bargain they basically struck was they accepted automation. They accepted, kind of not entirely freedom for the shippers and the port authorities to introduce any technology, but pretty automated ports. Long Beach is a massively automated port, and it's cost a ton of jobs. The bargain they struck was they said, okay, we'll accept this, but we want much higher pay. And West Coast longshore workers make almost double what East Coast longshore workers make. The East Coast workers are very militantly anti-technology. They want this is still an unresolved question, as they're now back at the bargaining table. The one issue they didn't agree upon was about automation. And so we'll see what that looks like. But just as far as different approaches here, and the fact that there is some bargain that gets struck. Obviously, we know, again, this is a time of incredibly weak labor power in the United States. And I totally agree that a radical flank helps in whatever is the outcome. But I think just as we look at how workers in other sectors dealing with other technologies have negotiated these issues in that time of weakness, longshore workers, I think, and their kind of differing approaches to technology are a useful case study.
Can we take both questions at once over here?
Hey, thanks so much for taking the time on this. I had a quick question about, you've talked about the evils of AI. Is labor using AI in, for example, strategic research, for campaigns, for organizing, or for negotiating benefits, looking at population health within membership and saying these are the issues we're having and we need to focus on these types of benefits? Are there things going on here or abroad, like our Works Council is doing some things that are different from in the States?
Yeah, I should know more about the abroad part of that question, but certainly domestically, that is one of the 3 articles. Mike is so proud I'm advertising the issue again. One of the pieces in the new labor forum issue is specifically about how unions are themselves using AI. And certainly around whether it's strategic research or member outreach, processing the endless, the spreadsheets that everybody probably, or many people in the room are probably familiar with, all that immense amount of data. Definitely various unions are using it to varying degrees, whether that's good or bad, different question, but it's certainly the case that like many other institutions, because again, it's we're in this world where it's a flood of data all the time, and a tool is being offered that can sort through that data. Of course, you want to try it out. The question is whether it's working and whether it's useful and accurate. And I don't know. I haven't had access or looked at or talked to the people that are using those tools. But it's a really interesting question for sure.
Thank you. That was really fantastic, helpful. So recently I read an article that was titled "The New Factory," and it described the thousands of workers around the world that are making the Silicon Valley stuff work. I mean, machine learning, I think it was. I can't remember what they're called, but they're gig workers, they're contract workers, they're low-wage workers, they're tedious work. They don't even know half the time what they're doing, and it's like taking advantage of people who need the money, and then they get thrown out. It's the new factory, is what they're saying. I'm just curious about what you think about that.
And let's take the last question. I think Aaron, do you have a question? Yeah.
Very quick, are we heading toward mass unemployment? That seems to be McKinsey is saying, 50 million jobs are threatened by AI, by these technologies. Do you give that any credibility?
I'll just answer to your point. It's another thing that Ed and I didn't have time to get into up here, but it's definitely the truth that another portion of AI is just like a lie, right? That it actually is not automated. It's just the rebranding of like low wage global south content moderation workers who are then basically told to, just sign NDAs or whatever. They can't talk to anybody. They pretend they don't exist, and then we call it AI. And yes, those are some of the most exploited people on the planet. These are often it's workers in refugee camps. It's workers, it's former and current prisoners. And then it's extremely low-paid workers. That is totally the case. And they're often exposed to extremely horrible images as well if they're in social media content moderation. The new factory, I don't know, I would just call it another factory. But it's certainly the case that there's yet another version of lie going on, which is that some companies are just calling their product AI when there's nothing automated about it at all. I'll leave the mass unemployment question to you. I mean, I'm skeptical, not only because it's PR, but also because so many of the new technology means just jobs to tend that technology.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we are heading towards mass employment the way we're like heading towards 4 degrees warming. Like if we let things continue as usual, if you give all the decision-making power, all of the decisions about what gets built, what gets researched, what gets designed, what gets deployed, what gets developed in the hands of the people it is right now, yeah. Because what are their interests? Their interests are not socially beneficial or productive ends. They're looking to maximize their wealth, and they're looking to maximize, the size of their exit and the deferment of the tax, so that they can translate that into more political power, right, and more wealth. So what are they going to do? They're going to use that to advance it in technologies that can automate work, that can or automate work and then translate what might have been a job and disaggregate it into automated work with a series of contracted jobs managing the output of that work, right? I mean, I think that's also connected to this question where it's like, what's the origin of computation? Like a Charles Babbage difference engine, which was constructed to figure out how to make slave plantation labor more productive, right? That is the original logic that drives a lot of how computational devices are implemented into systems. How do we get more out of populations after organizing them based on discrete attributes or tags that we're going to put on them and taxonomize them, right? Today's system has a large wealth of this new factory. It has contract workers. It also has workers in refugee camps. It has people in prisons. It has slaves. Like there's a vast web of labor here that's the same labor it's always been. And I think that what we're seeing when places talk about mass unemployment, when they talk about the disruption of society, they're also kind of articulating that, or hinting at this political economy that's going to emerge around work, where maybe people are not going to have full-time stable employment, but they will be expected to help train a fundamentally limited product, which is these neural network machine learning systems that are supposed to mimic human cognition, but for various reasons are not going to ever be able to, no matter how much data you put into them. But there's going to be a lot of capital tied up in that. There's going to be a lot of value tied up in that. So what are you going to need? You're going to need people to perpetuate the lie that continues on and on and on, which means, you know, armies and armies and armies of workers, of slaves, of refugees, of prisoners, continuing on the back end and helping continue the myth that this is a sleek, automated form of, or approximate form of human intelligence. So I think that's the reality we're probably going towards, you know.
Well, no one promised you an uplifting conversation this afternoon here at SLU, but I do want to end just saying that, you know, Alex's piece in the issue really lays this out, that, like, you know, things are looking quite bleak, but the labor movement really does have one of the key roles to play in mitigating the worst possible effects of the implementation of this technology. And as Alex also argues in her piece, like it does on basically every other issue that affects workers, has a kind of vanguard role in setting the terms for and what the protections are going to be, what the regulatory frameworks are going to be that are going to affect the vast majority of workers in this country and potentially around the world who don't have a union. So, you know, I can't prevent you from being too downtrodden walking out of here, but it does seem like that people who are involved in the labor movement in the 21st century, which are what, you know, what we have here at SLU, folks who are the foot soldiers in the labor movement. It seems like you've got your marching orders, and a lot depends on you. So go out and hey, protect us from the oncoming AI apocalypse, please. Thank you very much to Ed and Alex.